hemispheric challenges that have a sense within the region and that has been to be looked at them as hemispheric challenges. But we cannot work on the basis of finger pointing, on pointing out which is the country of origin, which is the country of destination, which is the transit country. Instead, we have to admit that we have a shared responsibility in the region. That does not prevent, that recognition of shared responsibility and also the recognition of national sovereignty does not prevent bilateral, regional, or global cooperation. But we have to expect different responses from states. In many instances, national legislation will determine on a case-by-case basis the level of engagement of one country with others. Reality always imposes itself and even may change the legal system to face new challenges. And we have seen in many countries, including mine, a profound legal reform in order to better adapt our legal system to deal with these common problems. If we want to go beyond national action and we're going to go into operational action in cooperation with other states, it's very important to develop a national consensus among all main stakeholders. Communication between all branches of government becomes crucial, mainly between the executive and the legislative powers. But more importantly is that we also have to embark in a trust-building process between all partners, inside our countries and outside our countries. If we don't develop such level of confidence between all agencies concerned, the chances of achieving success on this endeavor will be very slim. I came at the end of the panel before this one, and I heard precisely the point that there is not a common understanding of what exchange of information should be, that for some, they only expect to receive the information of others, but not to share our own information. And that has to be with a matter of confidence. If we are not confident in our own institutions, then it's very little that we will be able to advance. A good example of what I think is collaborative cooperation is the Merida initiative launched between two governments, Mexico and US governments, in order to better deal with drug trafficking. The Merida initiative, which is a political declaration between our two leaders at the time, President George W. Bush and President Calderon, is first of all a recognition of a shared responsibility. But also when the US government recognizes that there is a shared responsibility and that it has an obligation to cooperate with Mexico in order to deal with transnational organized crime, that is made on the basis of recognition of the national legal system. Therefore, one of the basic principles of Merida initiative is that this is a cooperation by means of training, transfer of equipment and resources, and it's very clearly established, again, and it seems like it was like copycat from the 1988 convention, Mexico has established very clearly that the US counterparts cannot do functions that are exclusively reserved to the national authorities. The question has always been there, whether we have to go beyond that threshold and that we should in fact start changing the paradigm in order to permit a closer level of cooperation and a presence of US personnel under Mexican territory. I see very little possibilities in advancing in that direction. But if that is a debate to be carried out inside Mexico, we'll have to look back into the minimum requirements to advance in that direction, which is basically the revision of our national legislation, a very intense process of consultation between the executive and the legislative, and the building of a national consensus. At this point in time, those issues seem tremendously huge for a country which is at this moment in an electoral process, and in a country which has developed a democratic society in which all voices have an opinion. How do we craft an opinion? How do we craft a consensus on the basis of such a diverse view of opinions? It's a tremendous job to be carried out. If we don't go into that process, the basic international framework that we have and our national legislation should be the basis for advancing this cooperation. Needless to say that on the basis of the shared responsibility that we all have recognized, there's a lot that all countries, all partners can do in order to deal with this common hemispheric problem of the transnational organized crime. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hernandez. Our third speaker this afternoon is Ambassador Adam Blackwell, Secretary for Multidimensional Security of the Organization of American States. Ambassador Blackwell is a former career Canadian diplomat. He is currently the Secretary for Multidimensional Security at the OAS, a position he has held after having been Secretary of External Relations of that organization until August 2010. Before that, he used to be the Assistant Secretary for Finance and Administration. I think it's safe to say that he knows the OAS fairly well. Ambassador Blackwell will be speaking today on defense and security seen from the OAS Secretariat of Multidimensional Security. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ambassador Adam Blackwell.
Thank you, Ambassador. I am at a distinct disadvantage here. I'm going last. Many great minds and much smarter folks than me have spoken previously, and I'm the person between you and the reception. If you will, I'm not going to read my notes because I think we've heard from the previous speakers and it would be a little repetitive. What I'm going to try and do is build what I think from the less legalistic, less statutory angle, what I think are some of the operational issues that we face in the OAS, implementing some of the political instruments. And the first point I would like to make, all of the speakers have spoken about the Declaration of Hemispheric Security. The one thing that I don't think the speakers have touched on, and which I think is an essential component of this, of the Declaration, is it's shifting the focus of security on states back onto the individual or to the person or to the human being. And I think that's a very, very, very fundamental and important point. I think the Declaration lays a very solid foundation for states to build an efficient, multilateral, multinational, continental security system. In my view, borders should not divide countries. They should rather link sovereignty. And this should enhance stability and security amongst the individual states and the hemisphere as a whole. Nevertheless, the Declaration as a political instrument didn't consider efforts to build action plans or necessarily how to implement the Declaration. Now, this perhaps was not important then, but I think the issues of implementation today are key. From 2003, leap ahead to 2012, there are so many challenges facing this hemisphere from a security standpoint. Let's not forget petty street crime and domestic violence. It still exists in alarming numbers. Unfortunately, the depressingly high numbers are driven by transnational criminal organizations, or as I call them, transnational criminal organizations, or as I call them, transnational criminal enterprises. With a Darwinian nature, they have an ever-changing product line and take advantage of weakened state institutions, gaps in legal framework, and frankly, these gaps in our discussions of sovereignty. I'll come a little bit more to that later. Some of the statistics from our hemisphere. Violent crime in Central America is an all-time high. Rates in the region are among the highest in the world. Over 80% of the victims, over 80% of the victims are male, and the preponderance of that are the youth. Homicide rates due to arms and weapons in North, Central, South America, and the Caribbean are 4 times the global average. The homicide rate with a firearm globally is around 40%. In our region, it's hovering around twice that. Youth in Japan have 50 times better chance of reaching adulthood than the youth in Central America or the Caribbean combined. Transnational criminal organizations, drug crimes, petty crimes are filling our prisons. When I look at the reviews we've done in some of the Central American countries that I've mentioned here, we're talking about overcapacity of in the 300%. So rather than dwell on what's not working, I'd like to talk a little bit about what we are doing at the OAS with our member states to try and implement some of these things. And I think the chairman of the Hemisphere Security Commission mentioned some. We do have an excellent action plan on transnational organized crime. It was approved in 2006. I'm hopeful coming out of the summit that we will be given the mandate and the resources to try and implement that action plan, which contains most of the requirements. The Declaration on Citizen Security came out of the General Assembly in San Salvador last year. And as I was mentioning earlier, the Summit of the Americas in Cartagena, the heads of state and government debated drug protocols in the view of looking at different options and scenarios, but not to overlook, they also reaffirmed the need to deal with transnational organized crime. Most recently, on May the 2nd, the Permanent Council approved a draft hemispheric plan of action to follow up on the Declaration of San Salvador on citizen security as a reference guide for developing comprehensive national policies and programs in member states at implementing the Declaration of San Salvador on security. Some folks have mentioned this before, but CICAD, a very important organization within the OAS, which has been discussing drugs and drug strategy for over 25 years. The drug strategy approved last year in Suriname focuses predominantly on demand reduction. And as in this very same building somewhere we discussed a few days ago, there are so many myths about drugs and where they come from and who is consuming them. I just want to leave you with one thought. There are 5,200 drug treatment courts in the United States alone. The consumption of cocaine and heroin in this country is down 40 to 50% over the last 5 years. Unfortunately, consumption of legal drugs, or the illegal consumption of legal drugs, is replacing the difference. SICTE, some of you have mentioned SICTE. It was created about 15 years ago following the bombings in Argentina. The Inter-American Commission Against Terrorism, frankly, has developed into more of a border security organization working with ports, airports, documents, helping countries obtain their certification in these areas, and frankly has provided and created a leadership role on cybersecurity, which some of you mentioned here, and I think we have 16 or 17 countries now linked up with our CCERT capability, which I think is a very important advance for the OAS. Somebody mentioned CIFTA, which is a binding treaty. I think it's the only binding treaty in the global architecture that deals with firearms. CIFTA is important as a treaty, but I think some of the things we've been able to do around CIFTA are equally important. We have firearms marking equipment, thanks to the United States, in about 20 countries. So we're developing standards of firearms marking and tracing. We've been able to build a program of working to destroy stockpiles of munitions, ballistics. We've been working in some countries to get IBIS equipment, and so that they can do a better job of tracing and tracking. So there are things around these treaties that I think are fundamentally important. The other thing that I wanted to mention, I mentioned this, touched on this a little bit at the last session we had. We have been working on what I would call trying to develop smart security toolkit, a systematic and systemic approach to dealing with security in our hemisphere. What I mean by systemic is looking at legal frameworks, looking at crime prevention, looking at enforcement, assistance to victims, the rehabilitation and reinsertion of those who are coming out of prison. But essentially, we have developed a methodology to do a systemic review of security structures in countries, looking at the 17 subsystems or sub-areas that form up a security structure in countries, trying to help countries develop a baseline. So what's working, what isn't working, what needs to be developed, getting a better understanding of what's going on in particular countries, but most importantly, working at the linkages between these organizations. I mean, I have been in many a country where files get lost from the police to the fiscal, to the prosecutor, or people are in jail even though their mandate is finished, and the system just has not been able to release them from jail. You know, I see some people nodding their head. Unfortunately, this is very true. So we have tried to develop a systemic approach to looking at the security actors, and we have tried to be systematic about it when we're offering options for our countries. Best practices, standards. How can we build on the ISO or ESO standards that Colombia has developed for building police processes, for example? How can you build the standards of prison management, correction services? These exist, port management, or others. I'm not making this up. It's something that we as member states can offer other member states. It's that matchmaking that we often talk about. How can we come together with things that have worked in one country, Plataforma Mexico perhaps comes to mind, and offer that to, perhaps on a smaller scale, but to some of the Central American countries. So a lot of our focus has been on countries like Central America and the Northern Triangle, and we've been focusing a lot of our travels and a lot of our reviews there. We've done a complete security system review in El Salvador, Honduras, and Belize, and we're now working on doing one in Guatemala, and next will be Costa Rica and Jamaica. I think that the Inter-American Defense Board could play a role here, and a very important role in helping us as we move forward in these kinds of systemic and systematic operations. I'm getting in trouble here, and I'm speaking as Adam Blackwell, not OAS, or not representing any country. But coming from Canada, where we have not had a war fought on our territory, we have not had coups. For me, it's with great pride that I have worked with our armed forces in places like Somalia, Sudan, and Rwanda, what we used to call the 3Ds, defense, diplomacy, and development, where the three were inextricably linked. We would go into very, very difficult environments and try to build some kind of sanity out of what was an almost impossible situation. I'm not saying that we have situations like Somalia or Sudan or Rwanda in this hemisphere, but as an individual, I am very concerned about the use of military in open-ended actions to provide citizen security, Remember what I said at the very beginning? The human being or the individual is at the focus of our actions. As I am about over-militarization of the police. I think we have to somehow or other find a balance. Somebody earlier mentioned Honduras. We've been working with the Honduran government. We've signed an agreement on Friday. We're going to be supporting the commission to reform the security sector. In fact, I'm going to be one of the commissioners. But the very sad story is there was a raid from a helicopter. Somebody shot at somebody, and somebody shot at somebody else. So the next thing you know, you have civilians casualties. Is this a military operation? Is this a police operation? Who shot first? What are the protocols? What's the law? And I'm not saying that we have all of the answers, but frankly, I think being able to have a mature professional discussion on the interoperability protocols and standards as we move forward and we look at how our armed forces, our private sector, our civil society, our whole of government can help link up. These are very, very fundamental and very important initiatives. And as I like to say, at our recent meeting of ministers of public security, we invited the private sector to come and speak with us. And one of my ulterior motives was to speak to the private sector about things like, how do you guys run your business? What can we learn from how you run your business? And can that help us run large institutions like the police? Or how about prisons? In many countries, including my own, there's concessionary approach to prison management. I don't think this should be impossible to have this kind of a discussion. The military have been able to develop hierarchies, structures, discipline, military justice. These are things that might be useful in our hemisphere as we try and build the state institutions or the state rule of law institutions. And I just want to leave you on one note. There are no quick fixes. As we try and rebuild the institution capability in countries like Honduras or El Salvador or Belize, this is going to take time. This is going to take time. It's going to need a serious investment in institution building. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Blackwell. I think by my time, we have about another 20 minutes for questions and answers. Before I open the floor, I do want to make some very quick final comments. How do we make them more useful? I think we've heard a wide range of careful thought here, ranging from some pretty solid theory to some experience and to some what is going on in terms of what the OAS is doing. How do we make them more useful? Perhaps one of the first things we have to do is look at what is actually working. We need to make public what is actually working. And to every story, there is another side. Just last week, I was hearing about the efforts in the Central American region, specifically in Honduras, in the fight against drugs, that with the assistance of some U.S. helicopters piloted by Guatemalan pilots and Honduran gunners, in Honduras, joint exercises that are actually functioning. Something like this 10 years, even 5 years ago would have been unthinkable. Having a foreign military flying aircraft over your soil. These things would have been unthinkable, but these are things that we have been forced to have to rely on because of the realities that are beseeching us. So some of the things that are actually working, we need to highlight them. We need to make them public. We need to show what is actually functioning. There is the other issue, the utilization of military forces to assist our police forces in confronting transnational organized crime or just the gang violence in our countries. And yes, there is a balance because, as Ambassador Blackwell was mentioning, there is some fear about over-militarization of the police. But in reality, if most of the threats of our countries are not the threats along the borders. The military being such an important element in the institutionality of any state, they could help provide the security that is needed. And then there is added value to it. In many of our countries, having the military out on the street, keeping law and order with the police, is actually helping to change the image of the military. And I don't have to go into the history of what that image has been in our continent. So there are good things that are actually working, and that perhaps we need to start thinking about them with a little more open mind. The other thing is about improved coordination. I totally agree. We have all of the reference points out there. We have all the instruments that we have negotiated. And most of them call for several agencies to start looking along the same path, to start pointing in the same direction. But many times, because of all kinds of issues, intra-agency suspicions, whatever, lack of resources, competition for resources, we're not doing that. Perhaps that is one of the things that we have to start looking at, the relations between the Organization of American States and the Inter-American Defense Board. It is something that just for the last 2 weeks we have been grappling with in the Committee on Hemispheric Security. These are the political realities that we have to deal with. How do we improve them? How do we use everything that is available in the best possible way? Anyway, I don't want to take up any more time. I would like to offer the floor if there are any questions, comments, concerns from what has been presented today. We'll start with the gentleman over on the left.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Colonel Rodney Smart from Trinidad and Tobago. A bit earlier on, we heard from Dr. Griffith that Caribbean small island states are challenged because of the resources or lack of resources that they have. We also understand that one of the challenges that they would have is most of the problems that affect them are really not their challenges, as in they were not birthed in the Caribbean. For example, drugs go north or they go east, and really it's the geostrategic position of the Caribbean countries that cause the challenges that we have. Now, if it is that we're going to build the competencies of the military to assist, and if it is that in our region, we don't have interwar challenges, or we haven't had for quite a while, is it really realistic that if we build the capacity of our law enforcement agencies, we could then let our militaries go back into barracks, especially given that we are countries with little resources? So as we look into the future, isn't the role of the military going to change? And the ideal that we speak about, the military in barracks until something happens, something in defense happens, really probably requires a new paradigm shift. Thank you very much.
Thanks for putting me on the spot. As I was saying earlier, I think from what I have seen, and what I have seen in Trinidad and Tobago, is there's a systemic response to all of this. Frankly, I don't think it's a law enforcement issue. I think it's a prevention issue. And until we can determine how we can help youth, unemployed youth, don't have education, find gainful employment, I think you can have the army, I think you can have all of the police in the streets, and you're still going to have problems. We have an unhealthy mix of smart youth, relatively well educated, perhaps through the influence of technology and television, have great expectations, and frankly, society is not delivering for them. And I think that that's at the front end of a lot of our discussions. And that should be at the front end of a lot of our discussions, because I don't think law enforcement is really the answer. There's not enough prisons and there's not enough space. Thanks.
Gentleman over in the middle.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, panel, for your excellent briefings. There's a lot of being said about some interesting plans on how we can make things better. And I know that on the United States side, there's CARC and there's CBSI that will provide resources for attacking these problems. Could you address the level of resources that are coming from other agencies, other banks, other governments? Thank you. Anybody?
I think everybody will have a little to say about this. From the perspective of the Organization of American States, one of the perennial chronic problems we've had has to do with financing. The countries simply have not been able to agree to an increase in quota for many, many years. Ambassador Einaudi, I don't know if you remember how long ago that was, probably since the mid-90s. We have not had a real increase in quota. Last 2 years we did token 1-2% increases, but nothing that really addresses the level of resources that are needed. If you talk about the inter-American system on a whole, there are quite a bit of resources coming in increasingly from private sources. I know the Inter-American Development Bank, for instance, is a very important partner for the entire Central American security strategy. More and more you're seeing these kinds of resources being pumped in, and there's still not enough. But we're not talking only about monetary resources. There is a lot of need in a lot of areas, including technical resources that are required, resources to be able to better coordinate, to share information, all of those things, and it's simply not there. Perhaps that is an area that needs a little more thinking from very smart people like you in the National Defense College. What can be done? Ambassador Hernandez?
Yes, thank you, Ambassador. That's a very provocative and important question, the one you are posing, the question of resources. And it's a reality that these resources are always limited. But my point is that resources and international cooperation must come from different angles and from different actors. Each one within its mandate, its responsibility, and its capabilities. And as Ambassador Mendez was mentioning, the OAS has its own limitations on that respect. But I do foresee the OAS, the capability of the OAS to work as a catalyzer of areas of cooperation where countries can identify which are the areas of cooperation that can provide to other countries which are in need of that areas of cooperation. Not only in financial resources, but as it was well said by Ambassador Mendez, also in questions of training, in question of capacity building, and so on and so forth. So the one thing is what international organizations can do, and then you have the OAS, you have the Inter-American Development Bank, but another is what we can also do at the bilateral or the regional level. For instance, the SICA, the Integration System for Central America, has launched an initiative on security, and that is being supported by several actors. Mexico is putting a pool of resources in the amount of $35 million in order to help SICA in different components. And in the Inter-American Bank is also assisting SICA in this regard. It was in the beginning of April when the three leaders of North America, President Barack Obama, Prime Minister Harper of Canada, and President Calderon met here in Washington. And one of the points that they discussed was precisely how the three North American countries should contribute more to Central America with resources in order to advance the SICA initiative. In a nutshell, resources are needed, but they have to come from the different actors at the level of international organizations, bilateral or regional levels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hernandez. I think we have time for about one last question. Right here, the lady in the front.
Thank you. My question is inspired by something that Ambassador Blackwell said and also Dr. Griffith's comments from the previous panel, but I'd like, Ambassador Hernandez, I'd like for you to answer the question, please. And what Ambassador Blackwell said is that borders should not divide countries but link sovereignty. And thinking about the earlier comments about sovereignty, are we ready to start admitting the problems in how we think about sovereignty? Because so many of the problems that we're talking about come from gaps or failures in the practical exercise of sovereignty. And Ambassador Hernandez, the idea of sovereignty has been so important to Mexican foreign relations. Is this something that politicians in your country could even begin to think about or to admit, that sovereignty, the traditional notion of sovereignty, isn't in practice what we think it is? And would that, do you see that as beneficial at all?
Well, thank you for that question. It helps me a lot to elaborate on some ideas of what I have expressed. Yes, you're right when you mentioned that Mexican foreign policy is very much based on the notion of sovereignty. But also, we are very aware that the notion of sovereignty has evolved through the years, and that the notion of sovereignty is not the one that we have during the Cold War period. That sovereignty now requires a greater level of cooperation. That Mexico has realized, and I think there are important examples on how we have advanced in that level of cooperation. Let me give you a very concrete example. The question of extradition of nationals. There is a sea change in the last 10, 15 years in the Mexican legal system, not only the law, but also the decisions of Mexico Supreme Court on the question of extradition of nationals. And we have changed from non-extradition of nationals to extradition as a tool of law enforcement. And in this administration, we have extradited around 220 criminals to the U.S., only to the U.S. So this is only one example on how things have developed in a more pragmatic manner. I can see in my country that there is a more pragmatic view on how to deal with those issues. But the hardcore issue has to do with what is required by law to our national authorities and what is permitted to foreigners. That is the hardcore issue. And that is a constitutional provision which precisely establishes that all law enforcement activities are exclusively reserved to national authorities. We have developed different kind of cooperation along these principles. Another example, there's a big number of DEA agents based in Mexico. They are attached to the U.S. Embassy, to the U.S. consulates around in the country. And their presence is very important because that helps a lot for the exchange of information. But the rules are very well established on what are the red lines and what's the level of operation of the DEA agents. There is a decree. Now, my memory is betraying me, but it should be around the year 98, a decree by which we established the possibility of accreditation of DEA agents as part of the diplomatic personnel in U.S. offices in Mexico, and those established what are the limits to be to cooperate. Therefore, there's not one single monolith concept of sovereignty. There are levels of cooperation that have existed in practice on the ground. However, we have a constitutional provision which establishes what it has to be done by Mexican and by others. If we want to change that, because whatever reason we want to advance in that direction, that would require a national debate on this single issue, which is going to require lots of political willingness, lots of dialogue between the executive, the legislative, the judiciary, the civil society, and frankly speaking, I don't see the ground is fertile to advance that, because at the end, what we have come to the realization is that the principle has worked, that we are doing our utmost in the fight against transnational organized crime, that we have advanced a unique era of cooperation with our partners on this endeavor. That yes, we have to say we would like to see the U.S. doing more in the question of reducing the market for drugs, but at the end, as I said, there is a level of cooperation, and within this basic legal framework, we have found the avenues of cooperation between the two governments. I mean, we would require another colloquium in order to explain where are the levels of cooperation between the two countries, which are immense. Never before there has been such level of that cooperation between the two countries. But of course, the challenges and the problem goes beyond us and goes beyond our willingness to cooperate. The challenge is enormous.
Thank you very much. With that, we have expired our time. According to Verizon, it's exactly 4:52. So thank you very much to all our panelists, Ambassador Blackwell, Ambassador Hernandez, Dr. Skocz. Thank you very much. I think they have done a great job this afternoon. Thank you for listening so attentively. And I believe now it's time to take a break.
Ambassador, thank you very much. The vans are here out in front. We invite you to use those to get up to the Inter-American Defense Board's Casa del Soldado. We'll see you there. Tomorrow morning we will start approximately 8:30. And thank you very much for your participation, and we'll see you tomorrow.